In this video we're going to look at medieval punishments. Specifically we'll look at the type of punishments and we'll look at how this affected the rich and the poor. It must be said from the very beginning that punishments during the medieval period, they were designed to act as a deterrent. They were designed to deter people from committing the crime in the first place. Now there are many differences and similarities in comparison to the 21st century to the medieval period. For instance, fines were commonplace back then, just as they are now. But what was very much different is the fact that some of the punishments in medieval times revolved around public humiliation. They were designed to actually embarrass people or humiliate people. What is different from nowadays, however, is that there were some very harsh punishments. For instance, burning people alive, and hanging does exist in some countries, but it no longer exists in ours anymore. But overall, punishments were designed to act as a deterrent. So a quick overview of the type of punishments during the medieval period can be shown here. It's a bit of a scale actually. You can see that it increases in terms of severity. So right at the top we had public humiliation, and we'll look at that in more detail shortly. Fines, and those fines went to different people in different groups. Then, of course, there were prisons, and we'll look at the type of prisons for the poor and the rich. And then there was the punishment of death. So let's zoom in and look at some examples of public humiliation. Here we have three examples. The first one is the pillory. Now, the pillory is where somebody would be put into a device, as you can see here, and their head and their hands would be trapped. As opposed to with the stocks, you can see that this didn't involve the head, it actually involved their hands and their feet. So that's the stocks and the pillory. And they would be used for, those devices would be used to punish, for instance, market traders who were trying to cheat members of the public by selling goods that weren't the correct weight, or swearing, for instance. In addition to that, here we have the cooking stool. And the cooking stool was specifically designed for women who may have been in trouble for scolding, and it was a device, as you can see here. It was a chair which was like a toilet, and they would have to sit on it, and they would be strapped to it, and they would be humiliated and embarrassed. Here we have an adaptation of that, where you can see some guy actually about to duck her under the water of a river. But nevertheless, this is around public humiliation. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, fines was an important part of punishments during the medieval times, just as it is here in the 21st century. Now, there were different groups of people who actually received the fines, and this depended on the type of crime that was committed. So if it was a serious crime and the crime was tried in the royal court, well, the fine went to the king. If it was a religious crime, and that revolved around, for instance, homosexuality, heresy, and it was tried in a church court, then the fine went to the church. And finally, for those crimes that were less than 12D, those designated as petty crimes, and they were in a manor court, then the fines actually went to the lord of the manor. Now, this is really important when considering the sophistication of the system at the time. Whilst it was by no means sophisticated in relation to the law and order and crime and punishment system here in the 21st century, it can be said that it wasn't actually primitive either. It shows that there was a range of punishments and a range of fines in place depending upon the type of crimes that were committed. Of course, prisons existed during the medieval era. Here we can see a typical medieval prison, and this is where the poor people went. However, if you were wealthy and you were rich, then you could afford to actually be in a prison in luxury. So here we can see this is a castle which also acted as a prison for the wealthy. So this is a big difference from the 21st century. There is a big sense of inequality during this era. So what I mean by that is there is a sense of equality during the 21st century. It doesn't matter if you're poor or rich, people are punished the same. But during this medieval era, there was a sense of inequality. Poor criminals were sometimes treated differently than rich ones, particularly when it came to prison. Remember, it's important to reiterate the fact that punishments during this period were designed to deter people from committing crimes in the first place, and the methods of death were particularly severe. Let's have a look at 3 of the 4 that I'd like to zoom in on. First of all, we have the being burned alive, and this was for those crimes that revolved around heresy and petty treason. So heresy being those crimes against Christian beliefs or saying things that were derogatory against Christ and God, and petty treason being when a wife killed her husband. They would actually be burned alive. And then we have a common form of death as a punishment during this period, where we look at hanging. And hanging was a common punishment because it revolved around theft of goods worth more than 12D and other crimes such as rape. Now, it needs to be said that there were other local methods during this period. So if a crime like theft of goods in a location like Dover, near the White Cliffs, then the local methods for death would be to throw them off, indeed to throw them off those cliffs. The final method that I want to focus on is being hung, drawn and quartered, and this was about high treason, crime against the king or the government plotting to kill the monarch. And this is when a convicted so-called traitor would be fastened to a hurdle or a wooden panel and drawn by a horse along the floor to the place of execution, where he would be hanged, and hanged to almost to the point of death. He would be emasculated, where if it was a male, his penis and testicles would be cut off. He would be disemboweled, meaning some of his internal organs would be exposed. They would hope that it would still be alive by this point, and then ultimately he would be beheaded and quartered, meaning chopped into pieces. And this is an ultimate form of a real gruesome, severe deterrence. However, let's have a look at how you could avoid the death penalty during this period. And the first one revolves around joining the army. Now, in times of war, the king would actually pardon those people who had been sentenced to death if they agreed to fight for him. The king was also involved when it was revolved around the rich people. So the wealthy could actually buy a pardon from the king. And this goes back to that sense of inequality at the time. The poor obviously couldn't afford to do this, whereas the rich could. That's in total contrast to the equality in punishments that exists here in the 21st century. In addition to that, you could run away and join an outlaw gang. And finally, you could also find sanctuary in a church. Now, sanctuary means safe place, seeking protection, and if you stay there for 40 days, then you would ultimately escape the death penalty. Okay, so let's have a look at pressing save, and let's have a look at the key summary points. Remember, punishment was used as a deterrent. It was used to deter people from committing crimes in the first place, and these punishments revolved mainly around 4 different areas. Public humiliation, for instance the pillory and the stocks and the cooking stool. Remember, fines went to different places. If it was a crime that was committed in the royal courts, then the fines went to the king. We know about the prisons and how most people went to the poor prison, but if you were rich, you could afford to have a more of a luxurious stay in a castle. And then we've just explored the different methods around death penalty. Essentially, we've talked about this sense of inequality that existed during this period between the rich and the ordinarily poor people in the population. And we finished on how you could avoid death in certain circumstances where the king could pardon you, or you may seek sanctuary in a church.